Have you ever wondered why someone with $10 billion would take out a loan? Elon Musk borrows against his Tesla shares. Jeff Bezos takes loans using his Amazon stock as collateral. Warren Buffett's company uses debt despite having over $100 billion in cash. They could just write a check. They have the money sitting right there. So why borrow? Here's what nobody tells you. They're not avoiding spending money because they're cheap. They're playing a completely different financial game than the rest of us. And once you understand this game, you'll never look at debt the same way again. Here at Simple Money, we've spent years studying how the ultra-wealthy actually manage money. Not what they say in interviews, what they actually do with their billions. Today, I'm going to reveal exactly why billionaires borrow instead of spending their own money, the tax advantages they're exploiting, the wealth preservation strategies they use, and what lessons you can actually apply to your own finances. Because this isn't just about billionaires, it's about understanding how money actually works at the highest levels. Let's start with what most people think about debt. Debt is bad, something to avoid, a sign you're living beyond your means. If you have money, you should use it instead of borrowing. This makes perfect sense for normal people, right? Why would you pay interest on a loan when you could just spend your own cash? If you have $5,000 in savings and you need a new laptop, you buy it with your savings. You don't take out a loan and pay interest. That would be ridiculous. But here's what's really happening. That logic only works when you're thinking small, when you're thinking about consumer purchases and normal amounts of money. At the billionaire level, the math completely flips. Borrowing becomes cheaper than spending, debt becomes a tool for building wealth, and keeping your money invested becomes more valuable than using it. Think about it this way. Imagine you own a tree that produces $100 worth of fruit every year, forever. Someone offers to sell you a car for $1,000. You could cut down your tree and use the wood to pay for the car. But now, you don't have the tree anymore. No more fruit. You traded ongoing income for a one-time purchase. Or you could borrow the $1,000 at 5% interest. That's $50 per year. You still have your tree producing $100. You pay $50 in interest and keep $50. Which option makes more sense? Obviously, keeping the tree. This is what billionaires understand. Their wealth isn't in cash sitting in a bank account, it's in assets that grow and produce income. Stocks, real estate, businesses. When they need money to spend, they don't sell those assets. They borrow against them. Keep the growth engine running while accessing the cash they need. But there's a much bigger reason they do this, and it's about to get interesting. Let me introduce you to the first and most important reason billionaires borrow. I call it the tax avoidance machine, and it's completely legal. Here's how it works. When you sell an asset for more than you paid for it, you owe capital gains tax. In the United States, that's around 20% for long-term gains. So if you bought stock for $1 million and it's now worth $10 million, you have $9 million in gains. Sell it and you owe about $1.8 million in taxes. That's a massive hit, almost $2 million gone to taxes. But here's the magic trick. When you borrow money using that stock as collateral, you don't owe any taxes. Zero. Because you didn't sell anything. You just took a loan. The bank gives you cash. You pledge your stock as security. No sale, no capital gains, no taxes. Let me give you a concrete example with real numbers. Imagine you're Jeff Bezos in 2020. You own billions in Amazon stock that you bought years ago for almost nothing. You want to buy a $500 million yacht. Yes, this is real. Bezos actually did this. Option 1. Sell $500 million in Amazon stock. Pay about $100 million in capital gains taxes. Net $400 million. Now you need to sell even more stock to actually afford the yacht. Option 2. Take out a loan for $500 million using your Amazon stock as collateral. Pay maybe 2% interest. That's $10 million per year. But your Amazon stock typically grows by more than 2% annually. Let's say it grows 7%. That's $35 million per year on your $500 million in pledged stock. You're paying $10 million in interest but making $35 million in growth. Net gain of $25 million per year. plus you avoided 100 million in taxes up front. Which would you choose? Obviously option 2. This is the tax avoidance machine. Borrow instead of selling, pay low interest, avoid high taxes, keep your assets growing. Here's why this matters psychologically. Most people think taxes are just a cost of doing business. You make money, you pay taxes, that's life. But billionaires think about taxes as the single biggest expense to minimize. Legally, through strategy. Not through evasion, but through structure. By borrowing instead of selling, they can access unlimited amounts of money while paying almost no income tax. They live luxurious lifestyles funded by loans, not by realized income. ProPublica did an investigation and found that many billionaires pay less than 1% of their wealth growth in taxes each year, sometimes zero. How? By never selling, just borrowing. The tax avoidance machine running perfectly. Now, this next one is particularly powerful because it compounds over decades. It's what I call the growth preservation game, and it's about opportunity cost. When you sell an asset to get cash, you lose all the future growth of that asset. Every dollar you take out stops working for you, but when you borrow against an asset, that asset keeps growing. You get the cash now and the growth later. Let me break this down with specific numbers. Imagine you own $10 million in stock that grows at 8% per year on average. You want to buy a house for $3 million? If you sell $3 million in stock, you now have $7 million still invested. Fast forward 20 years. That $7 million grows to about $32 million at 8% annually. Now rewind and try it differently. Instead of selling, you borrow $3 million at 3% interest using your stock as collateral. Your full $10 million stays invested and grows at 8%. After 20 years, it's worth about $46 million. You paid interest on the loan for 20 years. Let's say you paid about $2 million total in interest over that time. Your net position is $44 million, compared to $32 million if you'd sold the stock. That's $12 million more just by borrowing instead of selling. The growth preservation game in action. Here's a real-world example. Elon Musk has borrowed billions against his Tesla shares over the years. Those shares have grown by thousands of %. If he'd sold shares to fund his lifestyle and other ventures, he'd have way less wealth today. By borrowing and keeping his Tesla stake intact, he preserved all that massive growth. The psychology here is about delayed gratification and compound interest. Most people think about money in terms of right now, I have it or I don't. Billionaires think in decades. They ask, where will this money be in 20 years? And they structure everything to maximize that long-term growth. Borrowing lets them have their cake and eat it too. Access to cash now, asset growth for later. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The interest rates they pay are incredibly low, often lower than the growth rate of their assets. Why? Because banks love lending to billionaires. The loans are secured by valuable assets. There's almost no risk, so they offer great rates. A billionaire might borrow at 2 or 3% while their assets grow at 7 to 10%. That spread is pure profit. Free money, essentially. The growth preservation game means never interrupting compound growth, never stopping the wealth engine, just borrowing against it when you need cash. The third reason billionaires borrow is what I call the basis step-up loophole. This one might be the most controversial, and it's the reason some billionaires literally never pay capital gains taxes. Here's how this works. When you die, your heirs inherit your assets, and there's a special tax rule that applies. The cost basis of those assets gets stepped up to their current market value. All the unrealized gains vanish for tax purposes. Let me explain with a concrete scenario. You bought stock for $1 million decades ago. It's now worth $100 million. That's $99 million in unrealized gains. If you sold it while alive, you'd owe about $20 million in capital gains tax. Huge tax bill. But if you die and your kids inherit it, the basis steps up to $100 million. Your heirs can immediately sell it for $100 million and owe zero taxes. All those gains vanished for tax purposes. The government gets nothing. Now, here's how billionaires exploit this. They never sell their appreciated assets, ever. They just borrow against them for living expenses. They pay low interest on loans instead of high taxes on sales, and they hold those assets until death. When they die, their heirs inherit everything with a stepped-up basis. The loans get paid off from the estate, and the family keeps billions with minimal taxes paid. It's called buy, borrow, die. Buy assets, borrow against them, die and pass them on with no capital gains taxes. This is how billionaire families preserve wealth across generations. The assets never get sold, never get taxed, just passed down with the tax slate wiped clean. Let me give you a specific example. Imagine a billionaire has 10 billion in stock with a cost basis near zero, all gains. Instead of selling and paying 2 billion in taxes, they borrow 200 million per year at low interest rates to fund their lifestyle. They do this for 30 years, pay maybe 3 billion total in interest over their lifetime, die with the 10 billion in stock still intact. Their heirs inherit with a stepped-up basis of 10 billion. They can now sell everything tax-free. Or just keep borrowing themselves. The family paid 3 billion in interest over 30 years but avoided 2 billion in capital gains taxes, plus the stock probably grew to 30 or 40 billion during that time. The basis step-up loophole essentially makes capital gains taxes optional for the ultra-wealthy, as long as you're willing to borrow and wait. The psychology here is about playing the long game. Most people think about money in terms of their own lifetime. Billionaires think in terms of dynasties. They're not optimizing for their own taxes. They're optimizing for generational wealth transfer. And the basis step-up rule makes borrowing the obvious strategy. Here's the fourth reason billionaires borrow instead of spending their own money. I call it the liquidity without loss strategy. And it solves a problem most people never think about. When you're a billionaire, most of your wealth isn't liquid. It's not sitting in a checking account. It's tied up in assets. Company stock, real estate, private investments. These assets might be worth billions on paper, but you can't spend paper value. You need actual cash for purchases. Selling assets to get that cash creates several problems beyond just taxes. You might lose control of a company. You might tank the stock price by flooding the market. You might miss out on a huge opportunity. Borrowing solves all these problems. You get liquid cash without any of those losses. Let me explain with a real scenario. Imagine you're the founder of a tech company. You own 40% of the shares. That stake is worth $5 billion. But if you sold even 5% of your shares, it might signal to the market that you're not confident in the company. The stock price could drop. You might lose voting control. Investors might panic. So instead, you borrow 500 million using your shares as collateral. You get the cash you need, you keep your full ownership stake, you maintain control, and the market doesn't freak out. This is the liquidity without loss strategy. Access to money without giving up what matters. Here's a specific example. Mark Zuckerberg has borrowed hundreds of millions against his Facebook shares over the years. He uses that money for philanthropy, investments, and personal expenses. But he never sells his core Facebook stake. Why? Because that stake gives him control over the company. If he sold shares, he might lose that control to other investors. By borrowing, he gets liquidity without losing power. Best of both worlds. The psychology behind this is about control and optionality. Billionaires didn't get wealthy by giving up control. They got wealthy by maintaining it. Selling assets means losing control over those assets. Someone else owns them now. Someone else benefits from future growth. Borrowing means keeping control. The assets are still yours, still growing for you, still giving you power and influence. There's another subtle benefit here. When you borrow, you're essentially betting that your assets will outperform the loan interest rate. If you're confident your assets will grow faster than your loan costs, borrowing is the rational choice. You're using the bank's money to keep your own money working harder. Billionaires are usually right about this bet. Their assets do outperform loan rates, so borrowing becomes free money in real terms. The liquidity without loss strategy means never compromising, never choosing between cash and assets, just using debt as a bridge to have both. The fifth and final reason billionaires borrow is what I call the leverage multiplication effect. This one's about using other people's money to amplify your own returns, and it's how billionaires turn billions into tens of billions. Here's the concept. When you borrow money at a low interest rate and invest it at a higher return rate, you profit from the spread, and you profit on money that isn't even yours. Let me break this down with specific numbers. You have $1 billion in assets. You borrow another $1 billion at 3% interest using your assets as collateral. Now you have $2 billion to invest. Let's say you invested all in opportunities that return 10% annually. Your $2 billion generates $200 million per year in returns, but you only pay $30 million per year in loan interest. That's $170 million in profit on $2 billion in total capital, an 8.5% return. But here's the magic. You only put up $1 billion of your own money. The other billion was borrowed. So you made $170 million on your $1 billion. That's a 17% return on your actual capital. You just doubled your returns by using leverage. The leverage multiplication effect in action. Real estate investors do this all the time, but billionaires do it on a massive scale. They borrow billions against their existing assets to make new investments. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway has used this strategy for decades. Borrow at low rates, invest in businesses that return higher rates, keep the spread. Here's a concrete example. A billionaire owns a portfolio of commercial real estate worth $2 billion. It generates $100 million per year in rent. They borrow $1 billion against that real estate at 4%. That's $40 million per year in interest. They use that borrowed billion to buy more real estate that also generates a 5% return. That's $50 million per year. Their total income is now $150 million. Their costs are $40 million in interest. Net profit of $110 million versus the original $100 million. They increase their income by 10% without using any of their own money, just by borrowing and reinvesting. The psychology here is about thinking exponentially instead of linearly. Most people think about growing wealth by saving more or earning more. Billionaires think about growing wealth by multiplying their capital base through leverage, using debt as a tool to amplify returns. But there's risk here too. If your investments don't outperform your borrowing costs, leverage works against you. You lose money on borrowed capital. This is why leverage is dangerous for average people but powerful for billionaires. Billionaires have the knowledge, connections, and opportunities to consistently beat their borrowing costs. They invest in private deals, early stage companies, commercial real estate, opportunities that return 15 or 20% when they can borrow at 3%. That spread is guaranteed profit. And when you're doing it with billions, those spreads add up to serious wealth creation. The leverage multiplication effect means never being limited by your own capital. Borrow wisely, invest well, keep the spread, repeat forever. Now, let me blow your mind for a second. Everything I just explained, these 5 strategies, they're not separate tactics. They work together as a system. Billionaires borrow to avoid taxes. That borrowing preserves growth. The assets grow until death and get stepped up. Meanwhile, they borrow more to stay liquid without selling. And they use additional leverage to multiply returns. It's a self-reinforcing cycle of wealth creation and preservation. Each piece supports the others. But here's what nobody wants to admit. This system is only available to the ultra-wealthy. Not because it's secret, because you need massive assets to make it work. Banks won't give you a 3% loan secured by assets unless you have tens of millions in assets to pledge. The basis step up doesn't matter if you're not passing on massive wealth. Leverage is too risky if you don't have billions in cushion. The system is designed for people who already have enormous wealth. It helps them keep it and grow it, but it's almost useless for everyone else. Think about the contrast. A normal person with credit card debt at 20% interest is told debt is bad. Pay it off. Stop borrowing. A billionaire with billions in loans at 2% interest is celebrated as a financial genius, leveraging wisely. Playing the game, same word, debt. Completely different meanings and outcomes depending on your wealth level. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle. The rich can borrow cheaply to get richer. The poor and middle class borrow expensively and get poorer. The system isn't fair. It's not designed to be. It's designed to preserve and grow existing wealth. But understanding how it works is still valuable, because some of these principles can scale down. Not all of them, but some. Let me tell you about Tom. He's a successful entrepreneur, built and sold a business for $20 million after taxes. $20 million, life-changing money for most people. Tom was set for life if he played it smart. But Tom didn't understand the billionaire playbook. He thought having money meant spending money. He bought a $5 million house with cash, paid outright, no mortgage. He figured why pay interest when he could just buy it? He bought cars, a boat, funded his lifestyle, all with cash, all by liquidating his investments. Within 5 years, Tom had spent $12 million. His remaining $8 million was invested, growing at about 7% annually. But here's what Tom didn't realize. That $12 million he spent could have stayed invested, growing, compounding. If he'd kept the full $20 million invested at 7%, it would have been worth $35 million after 10 years. Instead, his $8 million grew to $16 million. He had $16 million plus the stuff he bought, some of which depreciated in value. Let's compare to what he could have done. Keep the $20 million invested. Borrow $2 million at 4% to fund purchases and lifestyle. After 10 years, his $20 million becomes $35 million. He paid maybe $1 million in total interest over that decade. Net position of $34 million. Tom's actual position, maybe $18 million including depreciated assets. He left $16 million on the table by not understanding how wealthy people use debt. Tom fell into the trap of thinking spending cash is smart because it avoids interest. He didn't understand opportunity cost, didn't understand tax efficiency, didn't understand growth preservation. He had enough money to play the billionaire game on a smaller scale, but he didn't know the rules. Now let me tell you about Patricia. She also sold her business, also got $20 million after taxes. But Patricia had been studying how the wealthy manage money. She understood the principles we've been discussing. She didn't buy a house with cash. She took out a mortgage at 3%, kept her cash invested. She didn't liquidate investments for purchases. She opened a securities-backed line of credit using her portfolio as collateral, borrowed at low rates when she needed money. She kept her full $20 million invested, growing, compounding. She borrowed against it sparingly for big purchases. After 10 years, her $20 million had grown to $35 million. She'd borrowed a total of $3 million over that time for various needs, paid about $600,000 in interest. Her net position was $32 million, compared to Tom's $18 million. Same starting point, $14 million difference. Just by understanding how to use debt strategically, Patricia didn't become a billionaire, but she used billionaire strategies at her scale, and it made an enormous difference. The key insight: Patricia understood that keeping money invested and working is more valuable than spending it to avoid interest. She understood that paying 3% interest while earning 7% growth is a great deal. That spread of 4% is pure profit. Tom thought avoiding debt was smart. Patricia understood that smart debt amplifies wealth. Same amount of money, different understanding of how money works, completely different outcomes. Here's what most people don't realize about why billionaires borrow. It's not actually about the money. They have plenty of money. It's about the system. The financial system is structured to reward people who understand how to use debt strategically. Low interest rates for secured loans, tax advantages for borrowing instead of selling, basis step-up rules that erase gains, leverage that multiplies returns. These aren't loopholes in the sense of being illegal or unintended, they're features. The system is designed this way. And billionaires didn't create these rules, but they understand them better than anyone else, and they use them relentlessly. The rest of us are taught that debt is bad, that borrowing is living beyond your means, that responsible people pay cash. That advice works fine for consumer debt and spending. Credit card debt at 20%? Yeah, avoid that. But strategic debt, loans at 3% secured by growing assets, that's not bad debt. That's a wealth building tool. Once you understand this distinction, you see the world differently. Debt isn't good or bad. It depends on the terms, the purpose, and what you're doing with your capital. Billionaires don't borrow because they're irresponsible. They borrow because they're playing a different game with different rules. And here's the empowering part. Some of these strategies can work at smaller scales. You don't need billions. If you have a paid-off house and you want to invest, a home equity line of credit at 4% to invest in index funds, returning 8% makes mathematical sense. If you have a brokerage account, a securities-backed line of credit gives you liquidity without selling and triggering taxes. You won't get the same rates as billionaires. You won't have the same opportunities, but the principles can scale. Understanding why billionaires borrow isn't about becoming a billionaire. It's about understanding how money actually works at the highest level and using those insights to make better decisions with whatever money you have. So let's bring this all together. The tax avoidance machine, borrowing instead of selling to avoid capital gains taxes. The growth preservation game, keeping assets invested and growing while accessing cash through loans. The basis step-up loophole, holding assets until death to eliminate capital gains for heirs. The liquidity without loss strategy, getting cash without giving up control or future growth. The leverage multiplication effect, using borrowed money to amplify returns on investments. These aren't tricks or hacks. They're fundamental strategies that define how wealth operates at the highest levels. The question isn't whether you can use all of these strategies. Most people can't. The system isn't designed for that. The question is, do you understand why debt isn't always bad? Why strategic borrowing can build wealth? Why keeping assets invested matters more than avoiding interest? Start thinking about debt differently. Not all debt is created equal. Consumer debt at high rates, avoid it. Strategic debt at low rates while keeping assets growing, that can make sense. Learn about securities-backed lines of credit if you have investments. Understand how mortgages let you keep capital invested. Consider the opportunity cost of paying cash versus borrowing cheap money. You're probably never going to borrow $500 million for a yacht, but you might borrow $50,000 at 4% instead of selling investments that return 8%. That's using the billionaire playbook at your scale. That's understanding how the game actually works. Billionaires don't borrow because they're broke. They borrow because they're smart. And now you understand why. What are you going to do with that knowledge?